The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Chapter 29. The Black Ghoul King and the One-Armed Sword King. While Vandaloo was in the royal castle with Nuaza to recruit the Sword King Borkus, the main members of the group that knew Vandaloo well, except for Sam, were gathered in a certain room in one of Talosheim's buildings.
It seems that everyone has gathered here besides Sam Dono, who cannot leave his carriage,
said Zadiris. So, Zadiris, what were you planning after gathering us all here? Asked Tarja. If I'm not mistaken, nobody called for you to be here, though, commented Bastia, elegantly hiding her mouth behind a folding fan that she had made herself from Entwood. Tarja gave a small laugh in response to Bastia, glaring at her through half-closed eyes. I cannot miss this meeting after hearing that we are all gathered to form a plan to comfort Van-sama after all, said Tarja.
I do not recall saying anything of the sort. Just where did you hear this?
Well, it is fine, said Zadiris. Zadiris had planned to have a discussion with only those who knew about Vandaloo's circumstances, his past lives, the god, the 100 people who would be reincarnated here. But since Vandaloo seemed to trust Tarja considerably, Zadiris decided that there would be no problem as long as she was careful with her words, and started the meeting.
Now then, the reason I have gathered everyone here today is to make you aware that the boy needs rest, and because I wish for you to cooperate with me in making the boy rest, said Zadiris.
Zadiris brought up the topic of discussion, but this only caused confusion to stir among the people in the room.
Rest, did you say? Pochan is sleeping well every night,
said Sarya.
Yeah, he's always sound asleep,
said Rita. Sarya and Rita, who were attending the meeting on Sam's behalf, spoke their opinions. Vandaloo was, in fact, sleeping very well, as the two of them said. He didn't even turn over in his sleep, and his breathing was soft. There had been more than a few instances where they had checked his pulse to make sure he hadn't suddenly died.
That's right, Zadiris. Vandaloo hasn't shown any signs of being tired, and if he was tired, he'd definitely say so himself that he needs rest,
said Vigaro. You're right. When he was making sauces and preserved food, he didn't seem any different from usual, said Bastia. As Vigaro and Bastia said, neither Vandaloo's behavior nor his facial expression showed any signs of fatigue. He had never even said, I'm tired, or I want to rest. He sighed often, but that was usually because things were not going his way rather than because he was tired. Because his breaths were so quiet in the first place, there was also a lot of times where nobody could even notice him sighing.
And everyone is treating Vandaloo with care. He really is a hard worker, but I don't think we're forcing him to do anything unreasonable,
said Sarya. Darcia, who was awake at this time, was also participating in the meeting by having Sarya relay her words. In response to the trust that Darcia expressed through Sarya, Zadiris gave a small groan and shook her head.
I am sorry to betray that trust you have in us, but we are demanding the unreasonable of the boy. Recently, I massaged the boy's shoulders, half-jokingly, but they were stiff. He didn't dislike it. He called it heaven and almost fell asleep, said Zadiris. I was wondering what you were going to say, but you just wanted to boast that you are skilled at giving shoulder massages. Anyone would feel sleepy from having their shoulders massaged, said Tarja. The elderly should at least take 5 seconds to think before opening their mouths. Remember that the boy is only just about 3 years old, said Zadyrus.
Everyone was taken aback by Zadyrus's words. Vandaloo was an infant who felt pleasure from having his shoulders massaged. In other words, his shoulders were stiff. No normal child of that age would have stiff shoulders.
And just think about how much the boy does in a single day. Incidentally, he does not stop his lessons in alchemy until he has completed at least 4 hours, said Zadyrus.
Vandaloo spent 4 hours a day in lessons, where he would crush materials in a mortar, mix them together, knead them, and pour mana into them. He also makes sauces from walnuts and herbs, and cookies with acorns and other tree fruits with everyone. We ran out of salt, and he was worried about finding an ingredient to replace it. He did come up with the idea of turning the mortar and pestle into golems so that it wouldn't take too much time or effort, but, said Bastia, even the work he did while chatting with people took a considerable amount of time. He did take care of us during our migration. He used lemures and undead insects to watch our surroundings. And most importantly, he created roads for us and then returned them back to how they originally were. Currently, he is making lumber out of the trees and repairing the buildings, isn't he? Asked Taria.
Also, he is practicing no attribute magic until late in the night. He performed small tasks with telekinesis while practicing his mana control skill, said Saria. Huh? Pochan wakes up early in the morning to practice his death attribute magic, doesn't he?
Asked Rita. That can't be. Then when is Vandaloo sleeping? Asked Darcia.
This is what I meant. The boy possesses the status effect resistance skill, so he is most likely enduring the effects of fatigue and sleep deprivation. He even seems to possess the surpass limits skill as well, said Zadyrus.
As Zadyrus was saying, with the skills that Vandaloo possessed, even an infant's body could endure the effects of fatigue, even to the point that Vandaloo himself wouldn't really notice that he was pushing himself past his limits. Because of his resistance skills, even if he was fatigued, his body still moved normally, so he would be under the impression that he was still fine. That was why he could endure being sleepy. So, even the time he did spend sleeping so that his development wouldn't be negatively affected grew shorter, as he would always think, "This much sleep will be enough." But the resistance skills only allowed him to endure this. They wouldn't remove his fatigue or help him quickly recover from it. And so, in reality, his fatigue was accumulating. And I've only just realized this, but Van rarely shows any emotion in his expression. I'm able to tell how he's feeling to some extent from his tone, behavior, and the air around him, but, started Bastia. And as Bastia said, Vandaloo's accumulated fatigue almost never appeared in his facial expression. His face was always white, almost enough to be called too white. It wasn't white in an attractive sense. He had always looked unpleasantly pale, as if he had smeared candle wax over his cheeks. That was why it was impossible to tell how healthy he was from the color of his face. And Darcia, Sam, Saria, and Rita had all been unaware of Vandaloo's overwork. That was because they were all undead, without bodies of flesh, so they didn't feel fatigue themselves. Mental fatigue may have been another story, but even though Saria, Rita, and Sam had only been undead for less than 3 years, they had already become unable to recall the sensation of being physically tired. In addition, Darcia was spending more than half of each day sleeping in her remains. Nobody could blame her for not knowing how much rest Vandaloo was getting.
Then why doesn't Vandaloo try to get some more rest himself? It's true that there might not have been any time for him to rest while we were on our journey, but it's different the past few days. And even on our journey, I'm sure he could have at least rested for one day.
As Vigaro was saying, Vandaloo could have rested if he wanted to. All he would have to do is tell everyone, "I'm tired today, so I want to rest." After all, he was truly the king of ghouls right now, standing at the top of their community. Of course, Vigaro, Zadiris, Taria, Bestia, all of the important ghouls recognized Vandaloo as the Ghoul King. If Vandaloo had stopped building roads during their journey across the mountain range, then they wouldn't have been able to continue traveling. But if they had chosen to stop at a spot where monster attacks would be relatively infrequent, Vandaloo could have rested for a day without a problem, and nobody would have complained. After all, without Vandaloo, it would have been impossible for the ghouls to cross the mountain range in the first place. No, without Vandaloo, the ghoul women would still be in Bugogon's custody, and many of the other ghouls would have perished after having their villages destroyed by the orcs. The ghouls had no reason to complain. However, words expressing a desire to rest had never come from Vandaloo's mouth.
Indeed. Why is that, I wonder?
Asked Zadiris. Zadiris and the other ghouls could not understand why this was. The ghouls were a fundamentally lazy race, though they would often need to tell each other,
"Don't rest, keep training, work harder."
They would never need to say,
"You can take a rest now, catch your breath."
Ghouls rested plenty without being told to, and if they were tired, they would just say so themselves. In this regard, ghouls were indeed part monster.
Ever since Father became a carriage, Bochan has been taking afternoon naps, but...
Saria said. I wonder if it's because of the resistance skills after all. I have a feeling someone told me that those born with resistance skills have poor awareness of the status effects that those skills grant resistance to, said Darcia. After careful consideration, this was the conclusion Darcia had come to. As a dark elf, Darcia had been born with a magic resistance skill. This skill caused damage from offensive magic spells to be reduced, and status effects caused by spells were less likely to occur and faster to recover from. And, as a result, she had apparently experienced more than a few situations where she relied on her magic resistance skill too much and sustained severe burns, and situations where she was trying to take an enemy alive in battle and cast a spell thinking, I'm sure they won't die from a direct hit by a spell like this, only for the target to be turned into pieces of meat. Because of this, all Dark Elves were taught about resistance skills while they were children, including how much of an effect certain things would have if one did not possess these resistance skills. However, Vandaloo had not been taught this. It was very likely that he thought he could simply endure things because of the status effect resistance skill, thinking, I'm surprisingly not tired. That's why he doesn't think to rest, and he might be thinking of the current situation as a state of emergency, because after I died, a lot of things happened, said Darcia. He had been desperate to survive since his mother had died, and he had been doing his best to gain revenge after that. As a result, he had come to work with the ghouls, but his original goal when he first met Zadiris and the others was to learn certain skills and then leave the Devil's Nest. And so he had worked hard in his lessons. He had defeated the noble orcs, led by the ghouls across the mountain range, and helped them find a new home. It had been a series of emergency situations. Because much of Vandalu's work had not required him to physically move his body, he might not have a good sense of having done work. However, everyone here knew that using one's mana caused fatigue. I understand that Van-sama is tired, so can't we solve this if we simply tell him to rest? They were now well aware that Vandalu needed to rest. But then wasn't the solution very simple? Taria suggested it might be so, but Zadiris shook her head.
If that were the case, I would have already told him to rest long ago, but the boy does not listen, said Zadiris. One time Zadiris had suggested for Vandalu to take a rest, and Vandalu did stop his alchemy lesson, but it was with reluctance, as if he felt that he could keep going. But he would continue practicing death attribute magic while lying down, and just when Zadiris thought that he was taking a relaxing walk, he was performing needless repairs on the buildings of Talosheim. He was always thinking of the next thing he should do and doing them on his own. When it seemed like he was playing with the Black Goblin and Anubis children, he was helping them with their studies and taking care of the live dead. He barely rested at all. He was also performing strange experiments to somehow make Bone Man stronger, as Bone Man was the only one of his undead who had not increased in rank despite reaching level 100. Now that I think about it, Van said he wanted me to teach him unarmed fighting when he turned 3. He said something about stories where one can become a master if he begins learning from the age of 3, said Bastia.
What? Why is he asking you, Bastia, and not me?
Demanded Vigaro.
Isn't that because your arms are clearly too long, so he would not be able to learn your techniques? You're the one who told us that unarmed combat for ghouls is completely different for men and women, Vigaro-san,
said Saria.
Vigaro, be quiet a moment. Bastia, if you are going to teach him, you must be skillful with your words and make the boy rest. So that is how it is, everyone. We must form a plan to have the boy take a break. I have spent so much time wondering how I could get the youngsters to train themselves diligently. To think I would also have to strain my wit to have them rest themselves as well,
said Zadiris. And so Zadiris and the others discussed how to make Vandalu rest while he was away at the royal castle. With Nuaza's guidance, Vandalu passed through the collapsed gate of the royal castle with some difficulty. These tall stairs aren't kind to infants, said Vandalu. The buildings of Talosheim were very rough on Vandalu, as they had been built for Titans, whose average height was 2.7 meters for males and 2.5 meters for females. Climbing the stairs was an athletic exercise.
My apologies. As you can see, the stairs for the use of other races have been buried in the rubble.
As Nuaza said this, he suddenly picked up Vandalu with his arms, that were only made of skin and bones. Even after becoming a lesser lich to be more precise, he hadn't lost his augmented strength skill, a transformed version of the superhuman strength skill he had possessed while he was alive. We haven't used it up until now, so I decided to leave it until later, but it's probably best to repair the royal castle as soon as possible, said Vandalu. If Darcia and the others had heard this, they would have stopped him, but Nuaza replied,
"It matters not as long as it is at your convenience, holy son. It would indeed be fortunate if you were able to repair it for us, but it is a castle where no soldiers or civilians live, and it will likely not collapse for several hundred more years," said Nuaza. For Nuaza and the rest of the undead of Talosheim, the royal castle was an enormous gravestone for their nation. If it were to be repaired, they would be happy, but it seemed that they didn't desire it so badly that it would delay Vandalu's plans. Even now, 200 years after the fierce battle, there were parts of the city that had been destroyed and collapsed. But the royal castle, built of building stones originating from dungeons, still stood tall. As Nuaza said, the castle would still be here for several hundred more years from now. Its impressive presence was enough to make anyone feel certain of that.
I understand. I'll do it if there's some spare time. So, where is Borkus-san?
He should be in front of a door to the audience chamber, which contains hidden stairs that lead beneath the castle. He has not moved a single step from that spot for 200 years, said Nuaza. Before coming here to recruit the Sword King Borkus, Vandalu had asked the undead titans, including Nuaza, what kind of person Borkus was. According to them, he was the only one of Talosheim's heroes to revive as an undead, and the most powerful among the undead titans right now. His personality was a heavy believer of justice and virtue, a cheerful, kind person. He loved to buy others drinks, but was weak to alcohol himself. He was someone who did not hesitate to say that a woman's charm was in her chest, while a man's was in his muscles. This is what Nuaza, who had apparently been among the intellectual group of titans, had said. The other titans had replied, "He was bald. Strong, strong, strong. His complaints about his wife and boasts about his daughters were too long. So annoying, but he was a good guy."
In summary, he was apparently a good person.
I don't have any confidence in my muscles. Is there any chance he'll say, "Come back the day before yesterday"?
Vandalu asked. Translator's note, this is a Japanese phrase that means something like, go away and never come back.
"I'm sure he will not. And speaking of muscles, I am only skin and bones myself," said Nuaza.
I suppose that's true,
said Vandalu. And after proceeding through the inside of the castle with the cracked walls and floors, littered with broken fragments of smashed reliefs and broken pillars, they soon arrived at the audience chamber. The Sword King Borkus was there, as if taking the role of the ruined door that had probably once been heavy and yet extravagant. His 3-meter-tall body was enormous, even for a Titan, with his bloodless skin covering his organs and large, piled-up muscles. Even as an undead, a powerful presence radiated from him. Borkus had lost his right arm in the fierce battle with the divine spear of ice, Mikial, and his enormous 2-handed sword had been broken halfway up the blade, but he had not lost any of his strength. Vandalu was sure of this, even without using appraisal. His constantly active danger-sense death was telling him, do not make him angry.
The youngster from the church. Who is this unusual brat? Asked Borkus.
The Sword King Borkus, whose skull was completely exposed on the right side of his head, glared at Vandaloo suspiciously. From the vigilant tone in his voice, Vandaloo knew he was resisting the effects of the Death Attribute Charm skill.
This is the Ghoul King Vandaloo, the prophesized Holy Son, said Nuaza. What? Ghoul King, you say? She is not a Dhampir, but a mutated ghoul? To be a Ghoul King as a little girl, even if you disregard the strange air about her, that means she's no ordinary person, observed Borkus.
No, I'm a Dhampir, not a ghoul. Also, I'm a boy, said Vandaloo.
Is that so?
Asked Borkus. Vandaloo hastily corrected Borkus's misunderstanding, but even though Borkus had said that Vandaloo was no ordinary person, he did not seem very interested.
I don't know what you were thinking when you came here, but I have no interest in what you do. If you want to settle down or take away the bodies of those bastards from the Shield Nation, go ahead, said Borkus.
Resting his broken sword on his left shoulder, Borkus looked down at Vandaloo. He seemed relaxed, but he would certainly bring that sword swinging down in an instant if anything were to happen. From his behavior, it was difficult to imagine that Death Attribute Charm was having any effect on him. In fact, it seemed to be making him only more vigilant.
I hadn't thought that it would be this ineffective,
thought Vandaloo. Vandaloo had never assumed that Death Attribute Charm would affect every single undead. Naturally, he had known that there was a possibility that Borkus would resist it. He had thought about that possibility, but he hadn't thought of any concrete plans on what to do if Borkus really did resist it. If Borkus were to become an enemy and Vandaloo couldn't charm him, he had to think of a way to defeat him. If Vandaloo wanted to build up more forces, he needed to think of another way. But now that Borkus had declared that he wouldn't have any part in Vandaloo's activities, what should Vandaloo do?
Well, I suppose I have no choice but to negotiate normally.
Well, that was the conclusion that Vandaloo arrived at.
Borkus-san, there is something that I wish for you to help me with.
Sorry, but I refuse. I have things to do, you see,
said Borkus. Rejection. It seemed that the recruitment negotiations had failed. No, it wasn't over. It was too early to give up.
Borkus-san, I can use Death Attribute magic, a magic that has never existed in this world up until now. It might be possible for me to grant your wishes with this magic,
Vandaloo said. In a negotiation, one has to present something that the other party desires, and offer it to them in exchange for the other party fulfilling a request. Thus, Vandaloo thought to first find out what it was that Borkus desired. Would it be revenge on the Merg Shield Nation, or the restoration of his body? Perhaps he wanted to find out what had happened to his daughters, who had escaped to the Orbomb Kingdom.
Can a brat like you really do something like that?
Asked Borkus.
At the very least, I've been able to do a number of things that were not possible in this world before, said Vandaloo.
Borkus asked his own question in return, but Vandaloo could give him a proud answer. This wasn't a matter of him having pride or not, but because he could use magic that had never existed before. He knew that it was only natural for him to be able to do things that were never possible. Even the most basic of death attribute spells, like sterilization and bug killer, were apparently difficult to reproduce using other attributes of magic. Hearing Vandalu's answer, Borkus turned his face, that had only one eye, down towards the ground, and then he spoke without looking up.
But you can't do something like removing a curse of a legendary class magic item, can you?
Asked Borkus. There were some legendary class magic items that inflicted curses on their targets or their users that even first-class mages could not remove. Such curses could only be removed by another legendary class magic item, a hero or any beings who could match the gods or the gods themselves. Would that not be impossible, even for the Holy Sun? Nuaza surreptitiously turned his mummified face towards Vandalu, with a concerned expression on his face.
A curse, you say? I can do that. I haven't used any mana today either.
You can do that? How can that be?
As Vandalu quickly answered that he could do it, Nuaza and Borkus simultaneously expressed their disbelief.
It's a curse, you know, one from a legendary class magic item. It's so powerful that it can't be purified no matter how many gold coins you pile up at the church,
said Borkus.
That is right. The High Priest Sama and Bishop Sama, who I cannot even be compared to, and even the Saint Gina Sama could not purify such curses. Never mind purifying it. What would we do if you were to become cursed yourself, Holy Sun? Demanded Nuaza. From the point of view of Nuaza and Borkus, Vandalu was saying the impossible, so their reaction was only natural.
Yes, I did it before. I was forced to do it, so I think I can. It's a curse after all, isn't it? Asked Vandalu.
However, from Vandalu's point of view, it was only natural that curses could be broken, so he hadn't the slightest idea why the two of them were so confused. Well, judging from their behavior, he had at least realized that in Lambda, curses were probably not something that could be so easily removed.
Curses are basically status effects caused by mana, aren't they? Depending on the curse, malice or hatred might be at the core of the curse, but the specific effects, causing incurable illness, bringing misfortune, or sealing certain actions, mana is necessary to cause those kinds of status effects.
For instance, sending a doll that has been torn to shreds to a hated person is nothing more than a psychological attack. If that person has nerves of steel or doesn't fear anything, then this will have no effect at all. Mana is necessary to turn a curse into something more than just a superstitious charm. Mana needs to be embedded into it through a ritual, chant, a sacrificial offering, or something of that sort. This was the definition of a curse in the world of origin, in which science and magic had coexisted.
Death attribute magic is capable of absorbing energy, including mana, to extinguish it. So if the mana that makes up the curse is extinguished, the curse can be removed.
Vandalu repeated the exact words that the researchers had once told him. Curses had previously been incredibly difficult to remove in Origin back then. Vandalu remembered how loud the excited researchers had been when the experiment had succeeded. Well, the success of the experiments hadn't improved the way Vandalu had been treated, nor would the researchers grant him any wishes, so Vandalu had never appreciated how amazing it actually was to be able to remove or erase curses.
So you mean that you can remove a legendary class magic item's curse?
Asked Borkus.
Yes, as long as it's not some incredibly unique curse.
Even as Vandaloo gave this answer, he was silently puzzled. He couldn't feel any sign of Borkus being under the effects of a curse, other than the fact that he was an undead.
All right. If you can bring those guys back, I'll become your subordinate, or minion, or anything you want. I don't know if this has any meaning to it now, but I swear it by my honor as the Sword King.
Those guys?
Asked Vandaloo.
Yeah, my companions who are still trapped by the curse of that damned spear ice. Please, release Gina and Zandia Jochan. I beg you.
Borkus's head had been far above Vandaloo's own until now, but now he lowered it to Vandaloo's feet.
I understand,
Vandaloo replied as he looked down at Borkus's hairless head. Monster explanation. Live dead. These are special undead, created when life attribute magic is used on a fresh corpse that have not yet undergone rigor mortis to grant artificial life from the outside, resulting in a soulless body with biological processes such as the cardiac and respiratory functions restored. They are corpses without souls. They do not even possess the most basic intelligence, and do not attack the living like zombies. All skills that the owner of the body originally possessed while alive are lost, other than the skills that he or she is born with. From this fact, there are scholars who insist on the theory that skills are dependent not on the body but on the soul, but they are in the minority. Defeating them is simple. If they are defeated in a way that would be fatal to a normal human, they will die. Their base rank is rank 0. They pose even less of a threat than a slime or a goblin. In addition, they do not spontaneously appear in devil's nests or dungeons. All live dead are artificially created by mages. The reason mages create these undead that only possess the most basic of biological functions is because their lack of souls make them ideal for use as familiars and to act on the mage's behalf. In such cases, the live dead's physical abilities increase beyond its normal limits and it becomes a dangerous enemy. There is a whispered story where the king of a nation suddenly passed away, and the people had been deceived by being told that the king was not dead, but simply lying on the floor because he was feeling unwell. There is another, although its authenticity is questionable, where the head of a noble family passed away without an heir, and he was turned into a live dead in order to make one. As it is impossible to create live dead who have sustained injuries that render biological functions impossible, including loss of blood, only corpses that have died spontaneously or of most illnesses can be used. It is also impossible to create live dead from the corpses of monsters, or races that were created when the goddess procreated with monsters, such as vampires, dhampirs, ghouls, etc., as their corpses contain residual amounts of mana following death.